The family so long that no one questioned it. It hung in the hallway of the Crane family home between a mirror with a tarnished frame and a watercolor of the Essex coast, unremarkable, slightly too large for the space. The kind of picture you stop seeing after the first few years of living with it. A family portrait, black and white, taken sometime in the early 1980s. Daniel Crane's grandparents sat in the front, stiff and formal in their Sunday clothes. His mother and her two brothers stood behind them. The garden in the background was recognizable, the same ash tree, the same low stone wall though younger, the wall without its cap of moss. Daniel had never counted them as a child. Children rarely count the faces in old photographs. They glance, recognize the ones they know, and move on. It was only when he was 37, recently divorced, recently returned to clear his late mother's house, that he stopped in the hallway and looked at the picture properly for the first time in perhaps 30 years, and counted. Robert and Paul, and standing at the far right edge of the frame, half in shadow, partly obscured by the ash tree, a woman he did not recognize. She was tall, or seemed tall. Her face was turned very slightly away from the camera, as though she had been caught mid-turn, as though she had heard something just beyond the edge of the frame. Her dress was dark. Her hands were folded in front of her. She had no particular expression that he could make out, and yet he had the distinct and immediate impression, the kind that arrives whole before you have time to reason it away, that she was not looking at something outside the photograph. She was looking at the family. "Who is this?" he asked aloud. There was no one to answer. His mother had been dead for 3 weeks. The house was empty except for him, and the slow sounds of an old building, creaks, settling, the pipes speaking in the walls. He stood with the photograph in both hands, tilted toward the hallway light, and looked at the woman's half-averted face for a long time. He set the photograph back. He told himself it was a neighbor, a family friend, someone who had wandered into the garden while the picture was being taken. He told himself this with the deliberate patience of a man who knows he is telling himself something and knows why. That night, he dreamed of the hallway. In the dream, the photograph was empty. The family were there, all 5 of them, but the woman was gone, and every face in the portrait was turned the same direction, toward the place where she had been standing. In the morning, he went back to the hallway. The photograph was unchanged. The woman was still there, in the shadow of the ash tree, her head still turned. But Daniel was almost certain, nearly certain, not quite certain, that in the photograph he had lifted off the wall the evening before, her hands had been folded lower, closer to her sides. Now they were raised slightly, as though she had just stopped herself from reaching out. The house had been in the family since 1961, when Daniel's grandfather had bought it new from a builder who had run out of money 3 properties into a planned terrace and sold what he'd finished at a loss to cover his debts. Number 14 Linden Street was therefore a semi-detached that attached to nothing, a house that stood at the end of a short road with a gap beside it where the rest of the terrace should have been, and beyond the gap, a long, untended strip of grass that had never quite decided whether it was a garden or a meadow. The house itself was 3 stories of red brick, narrow and deep, with rooms that ran one behind the other rather than side by side, so that moving through it felt like passing through chambers rather than spaces, each room complete in itself. Sealed, the next one a slight surprise. Daniel had grown up in this house from age 4 to 18 and knew it the way you know the place that shaped you, not intellectually but physically, in the body, in the way your feet find the loose stair at the top of the flight, without you having to think about it. He had not been back in 11 years. His mother had managed alone, then less alone, then not at all. The solicitor had been efficient and kind, and had sent him the keys with a letter that said gently that there was no rush with the property, that he should take the time he needed. He had taken 3 weeks. Then the paralysis of grief had lifted just enough to get him into his car and onto the motorway and through the gate of number 14 with a box of bin bags and a complete absence of any plan beyond not thinking about it too hard. The house smelled of his mother, a specific combination of the lavender she kept in every room, and a particular warm staleness of a house lived in by one person for a long time. He moved through the ground floor in the first hour, cataloging, not yet deciding anything. The kitchen, the sitting room, the small study his father had used and which his mother had subsequently used, and which was now just a room with too many books and a desk chair worn to the shape of someone who was no longer there to sit in it. He did not go to the 3rd floor that first evening. He told himself he was tired. He told himself he would get to it. He told himself that the fact that he did not want to go to the 3rd floor was simply the ordinary reluctance of a grieving man to confront his mother's most private spaces. The bedroom, the bathroom, the small room at the back that had no fixed purpose and had served as storage, and before that as a spare bedroom, and before that he now half remembered as something else. Something he had been told not to go into as a child without asking first. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table. Outside, Linden Street was quiet with the specific quiet of a suburban evening in autumn, distant traffic. A dog somewhere, leaves against the pavement. All ordinary, all correct. He wrapped both hands around his mug and sat in his mother's kitchen and did not think about the woman in the photograph, or about the 3rd floor, or about the sound he had heard from above the ceiling at precisely 10 minutes past 9. A single, slow footstep directly overhead, moving toward the back of the house. Narration note. Pause a full beat after toward the back of the house. Let it land. The neighbor to the left was a retired school teacher named Margaret Foss, who had lived at number 12 for 26 years and who arrived at Daniel's door at 9 the following morning with a covered plate of shortbread and the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting to have a conversation and has decided not to wait any longer. She was stubborn, Daniel said, which was the most affectionate true thing he could think of. She was, Margaret agreed. She looked at her tea. Then, did she ever talk to you about the house? About any difficulties she'd had? What kind of difficulties? Margaret considered the word she wanted. She mentioned sounds, she said at last. On several occasions over the years, movement in the upper floors at night. She was never frightened of it. I want to be clear about that. Your mother was not a woman who frightened easily. She described it more as a presence, a companion almost. She said, and I remember this specifically because it struck me as an unusual thing to say, she said that the house had always had a guest, and that as long as you treated the guest respectfully, you'd have no trouble. Daniel looked at the shortbread on its plate. When did she start talking about this? The first time was about 15 years ago, Margaret said. But I had the impression it hadn't just started then. I had the impression she was telling me something she'd known for a very long time, and had simply never seen the need to mention before. She paused. She also said, and I don't know what to make of this, and I'm only telling you because I think you should know, she said, that the guest was particularly attached to a photograph in the hallway. That it was important to leave the photograph where it was. That moving it would be, she used the word unkind. The kitchen was very still. The kitchen was very still. Did she ever describe the guest? Daniel asked, carefully. Margaret looked at him with the steady gaze of a woman who has decided to say the whole thing. She said it was a woman. She said the woman had been in the house a long time, longer than the family. She said she believed the woman was waiting for something, but she didn't know what. And she said, Margaret stopped, set down her cup. She said she hoped that whatever it was, it would come while she was still alive to see it, because she thought it might be something worth seeing. Daniel drove to the archives that afternoon and found what he was looking for in 40 minutes. A planning record from 1959, 2 years before his grandfather bought the house, noting that the property had previously stood on the site of an older building demolished to make way for the new terrace. The older building, a Victorian townhouse, had been vacant for 11 years before demolition. And before that, according to a brief note in the record, it had been owned by a woman named Clara Vane, who had lived alone from 1931 until her death in 1948, and who had, the note specified with the clipped bureaucratic sympathy of the era, died in the house, in the upper floors, and had not been found for some time. He sat in the archive reading room with this document in front of him and thought about his mother, alone in the house for 20 years, climbing the stairs to bed each night past the photograph in the hallway, not afraid, not troubled, saying good night, perhaps, to the tall woman in the shadow of the ash tree, keeping her company. He went to the 3rd floor on the 3rd day. Morning, good light, a thermos of coffee in his hand, all the props of a man who was being practical and not afraid. The staircase to the 3rd floor was narrow and steep, and turned once at a small landing where a window looked out over the gap between the houses and the overgrown strip of grass beyond. The window was dirty and the light it let in was muted and cold. There were 3 rooms on the 3rd floor, the main bedroom, a bathroom, and the small back room. He went to the bedroom first. His mother had slept here for 60 years, and the room held her fully, the dressing table with its arrangement of small objects, the books on the knitstand, the particular way the duvet was folded back, as though she had just risen and would return shortly. He sat on the edge of the bed and was still for a while and did not try to make it into anything more than what it was. The bathroom was ordinary. The small back room at the end of the corridor was not. He had expected storage, boxes, old clothes, the accumulated material of a long life. There was some of that stacked neatly along the left wall. But the right wall had been cleared, and against it stood a single wooden chair facing the room's one window. The window looked out over the back garden and the garden wall and the strip of wasteland beyond. It was a view of nothing in particular. Old brick, bare autumn trees, gray sky. An unremarkable view, and yet the chair was positioned to face it precisely, with the careful intentionality of furniture arranged for a purpose. On the seat of the chair was a small book, a journal, cloth-covered, dark green. His mother's handwriting on the cover, simply in her careful script, for the record. He opened it. The first entry was dated 22 years ago. The last was dated 11 days before her death. He stood by the window in the small back room and read his mother's account of 40 years of living with Clara Vane. Not cohabitation. That was too strong a word for what his mother described. More like adjacency. Like 2 people who share a house and have arrived at an understanding of each other's rhythms. Clara used the 3rd floor at night, and sometimes in the late afternoon, she sat in the chair by the window. She walked the corridor slowly. She had never, in 40 years, done anything that could be described as threatening or hostile. She had never entered the main bedroom while his mother slept. She had never come below the 2nd floor. She had, his mother wrote, once touched her shoulder very lightly. A single brief pressure on a night when his mother had been crying and had gone to the back room without knowing why, and had sat in the chair and had felt the touch, and had understood it as what it was, the gesture of someone who recognizes grief because they have carried their own for a very long time. "I believe she is waiting," his mother had written in one of the later entries. "I have always believed this. I don't know what she is waiting for, and I have stopped wondering whether it is something I can help with. Perhaps it is something only time can give her. Or perhaps it is something small that none of us have thought to offer. I have tried over the years to make her feel that she is known here, that she is not forgotten. I hope it has been some comfort. I think sometimes that it has." The last entry read, "I am leaving the journal for Daniel. He will come. I hope he will read this before he goes to the 3rd floor, but he was always impatient. If he has already been up here, hello, love. Don't be frightened. She means no harm. She never has. Just be kind to her. That is all she has ever needed." He slept on the 2nd floor in his old childhood bedroom, which his mother had kept as a guest room, and which still held the faint memory of him in the way that rooms do the particular placing of the furniture, a hook on the wall where a poster had once hung, the view from the window that was so familiar he did not need to open his eyes to see it. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about Clara Vane, who had lived alone in a Victorian townhouse for 17 years and died in the upper floors and had, apparently, never quite left. He was not afraid. He examined this carefully and found it to be true. He was not afraid. He was something more complex, a feeling he did not have a single word for, compounded of grief and loneliness and a strange, unexpected tenderness toward a woman he had never met who had kept his mother company for decades without either of them ever having chosen it, and both of them, it seemed, having come to value it. The footsteps began at 2 in the morning. Slow, unhurried, crossing the floor above him from the front of the house to the back. He lay still and listened. They stopped. A pause. Then the sound of the chair, that single creak of old wood taking weight, and then silence. And in the silence, the sense of presence that is not threatening and is not reassuring, but is simply the fact of another being in the same space, known and acknowledging. He got up. He did not think about it. He put on his socks and went out of the room and up the stairs to the 3rd floor. The landing window showed the wasteland pale under the quarter moon. The corridor to the back room was dark, and he did not turn on the light. He moved through it, by the childhood knowledge of the house, by the memory in his feet. He stopped in the doorway of the back room. The chair by the window was occupied. He could not have said afterward exactly what he saw. The room was very dark. The window let in only the thin light of the moon, which was enough to see the chair and the figure in the chair, and the shape of a woman's shoulder and a woman's hands folded in her lap, and the faint outline of a face turned slightly toward the window, the same half-averted angle as the figure in the photograph, not looking away, looking at something just past the edge of what was visible. He stood in the doorway for a long time. His heart was loud in his chest, but his hands were steady and his feet were still, and the feeling that moved through him was not the cold lurch of terror, but something older and quieter. The feeling you have in the presence of grief that has gone on so long it has become indistinguishable from the person carrying it. The feeling of standing near something that has been waiting and waiting and waiting, and has not yet been given what it waits for, and does not know if it ever will be. "Hello, Clara," he said. The figure did not move, did not speak, but in the silence that followed his words, something changed in the quality of the room, a shift as subtle as a change in pressure, as impossible to name as the specific warmth of a room that has recently held a living person. The room became, in some way he could feel but not describe, more present, as though something in it had been held very tight for a very long time and had, at the sound of its own name, unclenched slightly. By 1 degree, narration note. Complete stillness in the voice here. No drama. This moment is quiet. He went back in the morning with the journal. He sat on the floor in the doorway of the back room, not entering, not wanting to intrude on whatever arrangement of space and air the room had become for her, and he read the journal aloud. All of it. His mother's voice, his mother's observations, 40 years of careful, attentive noticing. He read about the footsteps and the chair and the shoulder touch, and the nights when the house felt full and the nights when it felt empty, and his mother's slow-growing conviction that Clara was not haunting the house in any meaningful sense of that word, but was simply in it. The way certain things remain in certain places, not by will, not by intention, but by the nature of deep attachment and unfinished time. He read for 2 hours. His voice grew rough, and he stopped twice, and both times he waited and then continued. He did not know if Clara could hear him. He did not know if what he was doing was right or useful, or merely the gesture of a grieving man who needed something to do with his hands. He did it anyway. His mother had written it for someone to read, and he was the someone, and the back room was the place. When he finished, the house was very quiet. The particular quality of the silence had changed since the night before, less taut, less held. The way a room feels after a long conversation has finally said the thing it needed to say. He went to the archive that afternoon and spent 3 more hours. He found Clara Vane's birth record, 1893. Her parents, a merchant and his wife, no siblings. A record of her taking the house on Linden Street, the original Victorian house, before the demolition, before his grandfather, in 1931. No marriage record, no children recorded. A death certificate, 1948, cause listed as cardiac failure, found by a utility worker who had come to read the meter, 55 years old. Alone in the upper floor of a house she had lived in for 17 years. He found one more document. A letter, preserved in a folder of miscellaneous local correspondence, dated 1947, 1 year before Clara's death. A letter she had written to a man named Alkit, care of an address in Edinburgh. It had been returned unopened, marked addressee not known at this address. The archivist had made a note in pencil on the folder. T. Alkit, no record found, possibly emigrated. Daniel photographed the letter and drove back to Linden Street. He went up to the back room and sat again in the doorway and read the letter aloud. He did not fully understand it. It was the middle of something, a correspondence whose beginning and history were lost. But its meaning was clear enough. It was a letter from a woman to someone she had loved, written in the plain and careful language of someone who does not trust elaborate expression because elaborate expression has too many ways to fail. It said that she thought of him often, that she had kept the house as he would remember it, that she hoped when he was able he would come back, that she would wait. She had waited. For 76 years, across the demolition of the house that held his memory and the construction of another in its place, through decade after decade of changed families and changed lives. In the chair by the window that looked out over the garden wall at the street where he had once walked and might, she had believed, must have believed, to have stayed so long, walk again. Daniel folded the photograph of the letter and held it in his hands and sat for a long time in the doorway of the back room while the autumn light moved across the floor and the house breathed around him, and the chair by the window sat empty and still in the way that a chair sits empty after someone has just risen from it and stepped out for a moment and will, perhaps, be back. The footsteps did not come that night, nor the night after. Daniel lay in his childhood bedroom and listened to the house, and it was quiet in the way of a house that has been returned to itself, not empty, not cold, but settled, like a long breath finally released. He spent another week clearing the lower floors. He did not touch the third floor. He did not go back to the back room. He understood, without being able to explain it, that the back room was done with him, that whatever had needed to happen there had happened, and that the right thing to do now was to leave it alone and let the house be what it was going to be without the particular presence that had been in it for so long. He took the photograph from the hallway on the morning he left. He stood with it in the hallway for a long time, looking at the woman in the shadow of the ash tree, her face half turned, her hands, still now, fully at rest, folded in front of her. He did not know what had changed. He did not know if anything had changed in any real sense that could be measured or accounted for. He only knew that the expression the woman had always seemed to him to be carrying, that quality of perpetual, aching anticipation, was gone. The face in the photograph, still half averted, still lost in its own shadow, looked simply like the face of someone who had been somewhere for a long time and had, at last, found what she had been waiting for, and was at rest. He packed the photograph carefully in bubble wrap and put it in the back of his car. He could not have said exactly why he took it. The house was going to be sold. The solicitor had already drawn up the papers. There was no practical reason to keep it, but it was a record. It was proof that she had been here, that she had stayed, that she had waited with more patience than most living people are capable of. He thought, driving south out of the city as the last of the October light faded over the fields, that it was the least she deserved to be carried forward, to be held in someone's keeping, to not be left behind again. He put the photograph on the wall of his flat in London, in the hallway, between a coat rack and a small mirror, the same arrangement by instinct rather than intention. It looked right there. It looked as though it had always been there. Clara Vane in the shadow of an ash tree, in the garden of a house that no longer existed, in a photograph no one remembered taking, on a day that no one could date, keeping her place in the frame. He did not hear footsteps in the night. He did not feel any presence in the upper corners of the flat or any shift in the quality of the silence. The photograph was simply a photograph old, slightly too large for the wall, the kind of picture you stopped seeing after a while. Except that sometimes, in the late evenings, passing through the hallway, he would stop and look at it. And on those evenings, he would have the sense, not frightening, not unsettling, simply present, that the woman in the shadow of the ash tree had turned, just slightly, not away from the camera as she always had, but toward it, just a degree, just enough to suggest that she was no longer watching for something that had not yet come. She was, at last, watching the world she had stayed in for so long, and finding it, for the first time, enough.